Hey guys, my name is Zach Weishar. Thank you for coming out on the last day for the last session slot. Hopefully you still have some energy left. So can I just get a quick show of hands, like who here is using Drupal 8 currently? Okay, awesome, so a lot of people. And of you people that are using Drupal 8, how many people are using configuration management? Okay, so a good number. Awesome. So, my name is Zach Weishar, as I said. I'm a Drupal developer here living in Austin, Texas. And I work for a company called Isavera. We're a Drupal design, development, and strategy agency based out of Boston, Massachusetts. So, we're here to talk about configuration management. In one sentence, I think configuration management allows you to take granular control of your database so that you can reliably manage change across your application. So typically, Drupal is made up of these three parts, right? They're separate, but also interdependent. You have your code, your database, and your file system. And when I say file system, I'm basically just talking about things that aren't tracked by Git, like media and images and whatnot. So if you're going to effectively manage change so that you can reliably make updates, you need a way to manage these pieces and their state. So managing the state of your code is a problem that's been solved with version control systems, like the most popular of which would be Git. Unfortunately, the same is not true for your database, and so this is where configuration management comes into play. So configuration management allows you to control the state of your database by exporting its configuration to code, which you can then manage with your version control system. And also, by the way, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to stop me as I go along. So here I have a quick video that can just kind of show you help illustrate what configuration is and the flow of configuration from the UI to the database and then to the file system. So we have my dev site here. I'm going to use this site several times throughout this presentation, and you'll know it's dev from this green bar, and I'll also probably tell you. So we're going to go ahead and add a new content type to our site. We'll add a blog post content type. And then we'll go back to the content type overview page. You can see it was added successfully. Now we'll go ahead and take a look at the database, just so you can see that making an update in the UI then flows into the database. So I have my configuration table highlighted here, and it's filtered by configuration entries of node type. So you can see the two that we started with, article and basic page. Those are the two that come with the standard Drupal installation profile. So we can just refresh here, and you'll see that our blog post node type was also added. Okay, and now the next step would be to export that to code, or to our file system. So we're going to use this command here, drush config export. And it's also important to note that you don't have to manage your configuration through the terminal. You can also do it through the user interface, and I'll show you that in a second. So okay, once you run that command, it's going to give you a little status message saying, all right, you're saying that you want me to export configuration from the database to the file system. As a result of that, you're going to be creating these 5 configuration files. All of them are related to the blog post content type we just created. So that looks good. We'll go ahead and let it do its thing. And then just so you can see that it worked, we can switch over here and see that we have our 5 new files created for us. Okay, so this type of workflow is valuable because it allows you to easily move database updates to new environments the same way that you would move your code. And also, you never lose these vital changes to your database because its history is managed by your version control system. So I have another quick video to show you what it would look like to move configuration from a development site to a production site. So this is going to build on our last example here. See, we have our blog post content type, and we want to move it up to our production site. You can tell it's production because it has this little red bar at the top here. So we'll go ahead and stage those files on our dev site that we just exported. We'll commit them, and then we'll push them up to our Git repository. All right, now we're going to move over to our production code base, pull in those new changes that we just committed. Now we have those 5 new configuration files from dev. Okay, and so this is we're going to take a look at the configuration synchronization UI. So you can come in here and you'll see these 5 files that we just added. And it also gives you this diff view, which is kind of nice. In this case, these are brand new files, so it's not as useful, but in the case where you're editing a pre-existing configuration file, you'll see on the left the active value, so that's the value that's stored in the database, and then on the right, what you're about to import, and so you'll see the changes you're going to make before you do it. So that all looks fine. We'll just go ahead and import it. All right, we got an error message. I'm not sure what that was from, but it worked. probably just a quirk of my local environment.
Same thing.
Oh, okay. Maybe not then. But yeah, we can see that it worked. So if you're using configuration management, you're essentially putting your database under version control. Not technically correct, but pretty close. And just to kind of drive home the point about the fact that your database's state is managed by version control, we can take a look at what it would look like to kind of roll back an update that we just made. So let's say, for instance, we weren't ready to move this blog post content type up to production. Well, we can pretty easily get rid of it using configuration management. So we'll just check our git log, just take the commit hash there and revert that commit. So we're getting rid of those 5 configuration files we just added. And now all we have to do is re-import our configuration. It's going to warn us saying, okay, you're going to delete these 5 files. That's fine. That's what we want. And then we can go back to the UI and see that it was actually deleted. So I should note, too, that if we had actually created blog post nodes, we couldn't have done that so easily. We would have had to actually delete all those nodes first. And then we could have gone ahead and deleted the content type like that. I mean, these are really simple examples, so you could just replicate what we did on dev on prod really easily. But imagine if you spent an hour creating and configuring fields in that content type. You probably don't want to do that over again in production. So this is a much more reliable way to manage those updates. Okay, just so you can understand how big of a move this was from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, I think it would be helpful to take a look back at how we would have done something similar in Drupal 7. So this was possible in Drupal 7 using contributed modules like features and strongarm. And while these treated us well for a long time, they definitely had some shortcomings, right? So first and foremost, there was no centralized API in Drupal 7 core for module maintainers to use in order to manage their configuration. They kind of had to just come up with their own solution. I mean, they had things they could rely on, like Entity API exportables or CTools exportables, but they had to choose and then implement their own solution. Secondly, features was not designed to act as a centralized configuration store for a complex site. It's really designed to bundle up small pieces of site functionality and move them between different sites. And so because of that, you run into some frustrating issues. Your configuration can often become spread out between multiple features modules when you're using features to manage your site's configuration. And when that happens, your features modules can start to have these interlocking dependencies where one relies on the other, and then it's really hard to update something in one without updating something in the other, and it can get a little messy. So also, features was really prone to merge conflicts when you're working on a team of developers, and that's because features creates these really long files that just store all of your configuration. So if 2 developers are making configuration updates at the same time and then try to bring them back together, you're going to get a nasty merge conflict that can be pretty hard to resolve. And finally, features is really good at creating things, but it's not very good at deleting things. So in our last example where we deleted that blog post content type, we would not have been able to do that in Drupal 7 with features. You would have to first remove it from features and then write an update hook to actually remove those items from the database. So Luckily for us in Drupal 8, these problems are all addressed. We have a centralized API for configuration management in Drupal 8 core. Your configuration now lives cleanly in a configuration sync directory. Merge conflicts are much less of a problem because configuration management in Drupal 8 creates a bunch of small files instead of one enormous file. And that really reduces the likelihood that two developers will be working on the same thing at the same time. And finally, the configuration management system is now capable of deleting things, as we just saw in our last example. And as a final note, features is not dead in Drupal 8. It's now just able to do what it was originally designed to do. All right. So now let's talk about a few things that you should maybe know about the configuration management system before you start using it. This first one is the one that tripped me up when I first started using it, and that's that the CMS in Drupal 8 core is only designed to manage configuration between two instances or multiple instances of the same site. And so the way that Drupal recognizes or differentiates one site from another is using a UUID, or a universal unique identifier. And so when you install Drupal 8, part of the installation process is going to be to set up that UUID for you. And what this means in practice is that once you've created your first site and you're ready to create a new environment, say you started dev and you want to start a test site now, you're going to have to set up your test site from a database dump of the dev site. And that's going to ensure that the UUIDs match. So if you try to import configuration with mismatching UUIDs, you'll get this fun message. You can't do that. These are different sites. So if you see that, you'll know what the problem is. This is what it would look like if you're doing it via Drush. I realize that's pretty small. So second thing that you might want to know is that sites own configuration, not modules. So modules and themes can provide default configuration that you might need to use that module. And you'll find that in the config install or config optional directory of that module. So what this means in practice is that after you've installed that module the first time, any future updates that you try to make to that config optional or config install directory are going to have no effect. That's because the site has already taken ownership of that configuration. So if you do want to change a module's configuration, you have to either A, write an update hook, or B, I suppose you could uninstall and then reinstall the module. But I think an update hook is the cleaner of the two options. All right. So next, we have dependency calculation. This sounds complicated, and you don't really need to understand how it works in the back end. Honestly, I don't fully understand how it works, but it's good to recognize it when you see it and understand what it's doing. So basically, Drupal sites can be really complex. That's one of the things that Drupal handles really well, is complexity and a lot of interlocking relationships. And so it can be really easy to make a change on one part of your site without realizing that it's going to affect another part of your site negatively. And so dependency calculation tries to save you from that. From that. So I have a video here to show you what that would look like in practice. So in our past examples, we've created our blog post content type. Now I think we're going to go ahead and create a blog post view to show our front page of our blog. So we'll go ahead and add our view. We'll show blog post nodes, create a page for them, and we'll show the first 10. Okay, so now we have a very basic landing page for our blog. Now let's see what happens when we try to go ahead and delete the blog post content type. All right, so it's going to prompt you with this warning saying, okay, you've told me you wanted to delete the blog post content type. That's going to have the following effects on your configuration. So the first few that we see here, entity form display for the blog post being deleted, that makes sense. View displays for the blog post, and field, the body field for the blog post is going to be deleted. That makes sense. One thing that you might not expect is that the view that we just created is also going to be deleted. And that's because that view relies on the blog post content type, so without it, it would be broken. So for better or worse, Drupal tries to help you out and clean up that view for you. All right. So I think I've used this term already, but we can talk a little bit about configuration stores. When you first install Drupal, and really for 99% of Drupal's use cases, the active configuration store is going to be your database. And that's the active configuration store is just where Drupal is reading in its configuration values from. And when you can think about it like this, when you're exporting configuration, you're really exporting configuration from the active store to your file system. And a quick note is that the active configuration store is configurable, so you can switch it out for other things like Redis. Yes?
I did have a question about this, because I haven't played with this a lot. And so you're showing examples, where you're using your workflow with the version control system that I totally understand. You're exporting your configuration. You see all those YAML files, totally obvious. These are files, they're sitting on your server in some directory. You get them committed to your version control, you push them up someplace, you pull them. That's all version control stuff that I'm used to. After that, though, isn't what still happens is that Drupal ends up reading, so you've updated a directory on Drupal, but it still ends up, it gets put back into the database, though, correct?
Yeah.
And I guess what's still happening, you still have, like, there's the directory that you've done your pull into. So like, you still have this stuff, the directory that contains contents of the files, but that's not actually being used anymore. It's gotten pulled into the database, and Drupal is reading from the database.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So as an example to maybe illustrate that, like you could pull in as many configuration changes you want to your sync directory, and then that's not going to have any effect until you import them. Is that kind of getting to the heart of your question?
Yeah, and I guess the thing I'm still just trying to totally understand with configuration management in Drupal, set aside the fact that you're doing one site versus another site, you're using version control system. If you just went in and manually monkeyed around with your sync directory on your file system,
you can do that.
Where is it going to flag you? Is it going to tell you anything when you fool with that? And it's going to ask, do you want me to pull this in? Does it take you going to the UI and say, oh, I want to now try to sync things? Like,
yeah.
How aware is Drupal of that directory once it's been pulled into the database?
It's pretty aware. So if you were to go in and manually change configuration files by yourself, and then you say, okay, configuration import, it's gonna pick up on those changes and then try to import them into the database.
That's what I said. If you say configuration import, but what I'm asking, I was like, what if you don't go to the you aren't using a drush command, you aren't going to the so it just sits like it'll just sit around there in your file system and
it never, yeah, it won't have an effect until you import it.
I feel like there might be a setting that's like, I think try to import it on cron or cachefree or something. You could probably write that, if you want to, like for prod or something, just always import it.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I'm not aware of it, but yeah,
because I thought
I'm
there's
sure.
something else that you could even do with your settings.php where you tell Drupal to read it from the file system. I don't know if I'm remembering that correctly. I thought you could change something that you actually, because like you say, you can swap it's configurable, you can swap it out as needed for other back ends, but I thought there is also a way that you say,
yeah,
a feature like that, but it might didn't make it into the 8.0.
That was the original idea, I think. That's how it started, was to read from the file system.
Directories before. There was like I forget the different names they had, and that's where I got confused, because when I think I read about that issue or that change record, I thought, oh, okay, we're not using these sync directories anymore, it's all in the database.
I think that modified into this. With
I think that's when they had a sync directory and a staging directory.
Okay, yeah, they had more than one directory that they used. Okay.
Okay. Cool. Thank you for that question. All right, next thing to know, just last two things here. In Drupal 7, all variables were global. If you're a developer here, you might be familiar with the vset or vget commands. And what that means is that all variables were loaded into memory on every page load in Drupal 7. In Drupal 8, we're only going to load the variables that we need so that it can just be more efficient. We don't need to load every variable on every page load. And last note, real quick, this is kind of a developer-oriented note, but there are two types of configuration. You have simple configuration, which is used to store data on your site where there will only be one copy. You can think of your site name. You might want to change your site name, but you don't need two site names. So the second type would be configuration entities, and these are used to store more complex data on your site, and there can be multiple configuration entities of a single type. So you can think of a view or a content type. Both of those would be configuration entities. Okay, so in order to understand what Drupal considers to be configuration, I think it would be good to just look real quick at the four main categories of data we have in Drupal 8. So first, we have state. State is information of a temporary nature, generally machine generated, and it holds information about the current state of your site. So for instance, the last time that cron ran. And when I first started learning about state, it was a little confusing for me to kind of understand when I was dealing with state versus configuration. So a couple rules that you can use to help you figure that out. You're dealing with state when the data is specific to an individual environment. You're never going to want to move that data between environments. And you can think of it this way as well. If you reset your system, you're going to lose all of your state data. And that's okay because it's not vital to your application's function. But you're not going to lose your configuration because that is vital. Second, we have session. This is information about an individual user's interaction with the site. This is really similar to state. However, it's stored in a separate way, so technically it's different. Next, we have content. This is something we're probably all familiar with. Things that are meant to be displayed on your site, like articles, blocks, basic pages. Finally, we have configuration. Information about your site that's generally, or at least can be, human edited, but is not content, and it's meant to be relatively permanent. So again, examples of this would be content types or views. I use that example a lot, but there are many more examples. So to help you understand the difference between content and configuration, these two can be confusing sometimes. Content is generally something that's created by site authors or content authors, whereas configuration would be created by site builders. And another way to think of it, configuration are types of things, like templates, and, well, that's a bad word in Drupal speak, but, and content are things. So things would be the things created from those templates. So article content type versus article node. And also real quick, there are definitely some gray areas when you're dealing with configuration versus content. The one that always gets me is the block, how blocks are handled by Drupal 8. So blocks are kind of this 50-50 mix of content and configuration. Block content itself is content, but block placement is configuration. Also, the same thing applies to menus. Menus themselves are configuration, but menu items are content. Yep?
Is that also still true for taxonomy vocabularies versus taxonomy terms?
Yes.
I actually have a question about blocks too, because one thing that confuses me further about them, if you go into the block module and you look at its annotation, it's got the @config entity type annotation as opposed to like the entity annotation. So even the idea of blocks being content is not 100% clear to me because like their annotation is saying that they're config entities.
But
That's the block type, that's not the block itself.
Right, that's the block. It's like saying the content type as opposed to the node. Right, it's the block container as opposed to the content of the block.
Yeah, because like when you go to the node module and you go under source entity and you look at its annotation, like the node is that's considered an entity that you're defining. And that's defining the node type. That's not defining a specific node there, and yet that's not called a config entity. That's using the, I think it's like the content entity annotation is what you've got in there. So it's, I don't know. I'm still confused about blocks.
It's confusing. And actually, I have a video here that might confuse you further. So I'm going to kind of demonstrate that weird gray area and how you might get hit with it when you're trying to manage configuration. So we're going to go ahead on our dev site and add a custom block. And we're going to go ahead and place it in our sidebar region. Okay, we can go back to our front page. We can see that it was successfully placed. That's exactly what we would expect. So now that block looks awesome. Let's move that up to production using configuration management. So we'll go ahead and export as we've seen before. See some configurations. Okay, go ahead, export those. We can add them and commit them. And then push them up to our remote. Then we can switch over to our production code base, pull those changes in, and import them. And you might expect that we'd have a really working block on our production site now. So we'll move over to production, refresh, and so you can see that the block placement made it over. That's what we would expect. That looks great. But now let's see what it looks like on the front end. Oops. That's small, but it says this block is broken or missing. You may be missing content, or you might need to enable the original module. And that's the broken block handler. Basically, you've transferred over its placement, but we don't know what to put there because there's no block content to go there. So if you see that, you'll know why that happened. And we can talk about some potential solutions to that in a minute. All right, so now we can get into some of the more useful tips and tricks for managing configuration. So by default, when you install Drupal, Drupal is going to set up a configuration sync directory for you. And it's going to put it at site's default files, config _ the UUID for your site. And so just a real quick note, it does that because you could have sensitive information in your configuration directory that you wouldn't want someone to see. And so Drupal is kind of adopting this security via obscurity principle, basically. It's going to be hard for an attacker to guess what the UUID is for your site. So it's going to be hard for them to find this directory. You can go a step further and configure or tell Drupal where you want your sync directory to live. So at Isavera, one thing that we usually do is put it one level above the web root so that it could never be served by the web server at all because it's above it. And that way, an attacker will never see it, basically, unless they gain access to your server at that point. You have bigger problems. So by default, maybe as you've seen with our examples, configuration import and export is an all or nothing type thing. When you're exporting, you're saying, okay, take all the configuration in my database and put it onto my file system, regardless of what's already there. And the same thing is true when you import. It's saying, okay, look at the file system and import it all to the database. So luckily we have this partial flag, which can be helpful. And I'll have a quick video to show you how that could be helpful. So let's say you're a developer working on the dev site. You're going to make some configuration changes. In this example, we're going to add an image field to our article content type. So we go ahead and save that. While we're doing this, one of our content authors, who just went through a great Drupal training, now knows how to create views. So they're going to go ahead and create a view right on production. They don't know about configuration management, so they don't see this as a problem. Okay, they've created their view, updated the configuration. Now we've switched back to our developer role. We want to deploy that configuration update we just made. So we'll go through these steps that we've been going through. Now we've switched over. Sorry, that was a quick transition. Now we're on the we've exported, pushed, and now we're pulled back into prod, and now we're ready to import those changes. So okay, we get the kind of summary of what's about to happen. The first 4 things look normal. That's what we would expect. The last thing is something that we don't expect, right? We don't know that that content author created that view, and we're about to delete it if we import this content or this configuration. So we caught that, and we decided to say, no, let's not do that. Instead, you can use the partial flag. And what that's going to do is not delete anything that's untracked. If you change something that was already tracked, it would still blow that away. but at least it saves you for things that are totally new. Okay, another useful thing that you can use is the skip modules flag. And so this is really useful for when you're working locally and you have modules enabled that you would never want on production. So when you're working locally, you might want the develop module enabled. You definitely do not want that on production. So to keep yourself safe, you can just never export its configuration if you use this flag here. And that way, those configurations will never make it to production.
Do you know, can you make that like an array?
I think an easier way to do this, I believe you can set up like Drush aliases, or there's some way to configure this so that it'll just do this automatically, and you can manage your list of skip modules. I don't remember the exact term, but I think it's Drush aliases.
Yeah,
Okay. Okay, another module that we can talk about here is configuration split. This is one of my favorite configuration-related modules. And basically what this is going to allow you to do is have separate configuration values for certain things on a per environment basis. And what that's doing on the back end is splitting out your configuration sync directory into multiple pieces. And so I have a video here to show you what that looks like. So I've already gone ahead and installed the config split module on my development environment, and I've created 2 splits. So the way that I usually like to do it is to create 1 split per environment. Since we were only dealing with dev and prod in this example, we just need 2. So we can go ahead here and edit. You tell it where you want this split to live. And then you come down here to the blacklist, and this is like the heart of the module, really. This is telling it which configuration items you want this split to manage. So I could go ahead and select on a per module basis. Like for instance, if I selected the block module, all block-related configuration would now be managed by this split, this prod split. In this case, I'm going to use a demonstration, or I'm going to demonstrate managing the performance settings for a site using this module, because that's something that you might want to be different on production than locally. So we can go ahead and save that. Move over. We're still on our dev site here. And these are the performance settings that we have set up for development. No caching, no aggregation. That speeds up your feedback cycle. That's probably how you want to work on your site locally. But that's definitely not what you want in production, or at least usually not. So we'll go ahead and update our settings to what we would want in production. Save them. And then we'll move over to our command line. And we're using a slightly different command here. And I should note that if you're using a more recent version of Drush, you don't actually need to use this updated command, CSEX. But since I'm using an older version, I do need to use that. And that just stands for configuration split export. And then you give it the name of the split that you want to export that configuration to. So okay, we'll export the prod configurations. We're only tracking one thing in the prod configuration split, and that's the performance settings. So you can see that I exported that configuration file.
So you blacklisted that on dev, and now prod will.
So I only blacklisted it on the prod split.
Prod.
Yeah, you could blacklist it. You could manage it on every single split and have different settings. So if you want a different setting on dev, different setting on test, different setting on prod, you would just add that to all of those splits.
I see. So if you went back and changed it to something else and did a config split export dev, now my dev settings have a different animal. I see.
Yep, exactly. And so what this is doing kind of on the back end is you still have your central configuration store, and then you have your splits. And when you say import, it's going to take what's in your central store and then merge in what's with the split that you want. And so it just brings it all together for you. You can see what that would look like. Okay, we pulled in that change to prod. Now, just to show you, the performance settings on prod before we import are the same as they were on dev. Now we can go ahead and import. Oops. And again, we have that modified import command, configuration split import. But again, if you're using a newer version of Drush, you don't need that.
So do you mean that it would just be the new Drush overrides?
Yeah, you can. Yeah, exactly. But you still have to provide the environment flag.
Okay, cool. That's really cool. I've been playing with that config split. You helped me you just clarified a bunch for me there.
Yeah.
Could I ask you, I thought, what is the gray list? I haven't been able to figure out what that's all about.
Honestly, I'm not quite sure. Yeah. Yeah.
What the hell is gray
It's like
list?
in between, man. Come on.
Alright.
Yeah. I wish I could tell you. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
I don't know if they finished filling it out when I was in mid-camp. I don't know if I was talking to the person who's working on a config split or he's working on an alternative to config split, but I one way or another, I've been talking something about the notion of the gray list, and I don't think it's going to be used for something, but I don't know if they built the functionality to do anything with it yet.
Okay. That would make sense. There is some help text below. I read through it and I still didn't really understand what it was going to do, so I don't know. All right, so here, this is another use of config split that you can use to kind of get around that weird gray area with the block placement settings that I showed before. So one thing, an idea that I had would be to create an ignored split. And so what this is going to allow us to do is designate certain configuration items that we just want to go into this ignored split. We can then ignore that from Git, so that's not muddying up our Git history. And then we can allow each environment to manage their own block placement configurations. And so the way that I did that was to use this, this wildcard right here. Any block placement configuration starts with block.block, and then whatever the name of the block is after that. So what this is, yeah, sorry, lost my train of thought there. Yeah, so basically this way, when you move configurations between your different environments, you're not going to be overriding your block placement on those environments because that environment is managing its own block placement. What's in that ignored directory is probably going to be different on every environment, but that's okay because you've ignored it from Git and you're basically ignoring it, you don't care about it. And that's going to allow your content editors to change where blocks are placed in their sidebar or whatever region you want. And that's something that my clients want all the time. The way that I should also note that I haven't actually tried this in production yet. So take that into account. But I'm going to try it on my next project, and I think it's going to work fine. The way that I get around this currently is to go onto production every single time before I deploy and check for configuration overrides. If there are any, then I have to pull them back and merge them into my code before I deploy, so to make sure I'm not overriding what my content editors have done. Yes?
Do you personally are using kind of notification systems to overrides on the pod?
I don't usually. I just have, so the way that I do deployments is to have a deployment checklist, and I just go through, and that's just one of my items, so I make sure never to skip it. That would be a good idea for a module. If it doesn't exist. Another option you have for managing those gray area scenarios, this is a much more strict option, is to use configuration read only. And what this is going to allow you to do is designate certain environments, probably production, that you do not want to allow any configuration updates to be made on. So let's say one of our content admins tries to go and delete something, change configuration on prod. You're going to be hit with this message. I'm sorry that's small, but it basically says this configuration is read-only. You can't do what you're trying to do. Okay, last helpful module. This helps you get around the UUID issue that I talked about before, is the configuration installer module. And this is going to allow you to install a new site with pre-existing configuration. And so the way that this works is that it creates an installation profile for you. So when you go ahead and install Drupal, you're going to get this config installer profile that you select. And then you're going to go ahead and tell it where that configuration is on your file system, and it will spin up your site and import those configurations, and you'll be good to go. All right, and that's it for my presentation. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
Can you get to these slides? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so they'll be up here. Yep.
You could do that last configuration install with Drush, I think without that module. You can just
Oh, really?
the configuration directory, it will install minimal, and then override it with your configuration.
Oh, that's good to
You don't
know.
have to wipe out the UUIDs.
That's awesome. I'll have to look into that. Thank you.
Is the configuration regarding module like all or nothing? It is like locking the whole site, or you can lock only some parts that you want to override?
Yeah, it's really all or nothing. So you might be able to make clever use of config split to handle the use case that you're talking about, but I'm not sure that config read only is going to help there. Yep.
Another question related to config split. Does like each environment needs to be aware of what they are in the split? Like the dev side needs to know that I am dev, and the prod side needs to know that I am prod. Like you need to do some configuration before using the module.
Yeah, so you don't have to. The only way that you would need, if you're going to use the UI to do this, then you do need to configure it. And how you do that, there are a few lines that you add to settings.php to tell it which environment it is. If you're using the command line, then you don't need to do that because you just add that environment flag at the end. And so you're just aware of what site you're importing your configuration to. All right. If there's no other questions, I guess that's it. I can get my...
About 3 slides back, you got a typo.
Oh, do I? Not surprised. Here?
Right there, I think. Yeah.
Existing?
Want to install.
Oh, thank you. I'll change that.
So I could find this about the gray list.
Okay.
I don't know if I've read that or not.
Will not be removed, clearing active sync. It's also not exported. Oh, interesting. Huh.
I just
That's good to know.
I did a quick Google. I was like, oh,
Yeah.
hey, this is exactly what they're talking about. Scroll down and read it. I was like, all right.
That's awesome. Thank you.
In case you get that question again.
Yeah.